Would you know an exclamation point if you saw one in a wrestling ring? That's next on Till We Make It. I'm Mike Quackenbush. This is Till We Make It. Throughout my career, I've been very fortunate because I've worked in front of the cameras as a professional wrestler, a referee, a ring announcer, and a commentator. And I've had the opportunity to work behind the scenes as well as a promoter, booker, agent, coach, and consultant. And I've gathered up all my experience and all my knowledge from doing all of those jobs and a couple others as well. And I bring that right here twice a week, every Wednesday and Friday to you via Till We Make It. Today, I want to crack open a concept which is firmly in the performative category. And if you've never heard that before, let me define this very quickly for you. I think everything which makes up a professional wrestling match or performance can be broken up into one of three categories. It is either mechanical, performative, or structural. Mechanics refer to the physical movements, the moves, the spots, etc. And of course, the structure is the underlying architecture that forms the storytelling element. But the performative elements, which is what we're going to talk about today, or at least one of them anyhow, is the way in which we perform. And I spend a lot of time and a lot of ink on topics relating to performance and structure in my books like 7 Keys to Becoming a Better Performer and Toolbox, Building Better Pro Wrestling. So those are extreme deep dives if this type of topic interests you. What I want to talk about today is at least in part related to the concept of phrasing. And there is a video already on the channel about that. I'll link you at the end of today's video so you can jump right to that after listening to this examination of the idea of punctuation. And this is not a new idea. It's certainly not one unique to me. I first heard it back in the 1990s, conveyed to me by my frequent traveling mate and in-ring rival, the reckless youth, Tom Carter. And I've since heard it paraphrased by lots of people, including Sami Zayn. And keep in mind, of course, this is performance related, even though you might hear punctuation and think grammar. So let's return to the question I posed to you at the top of today's video. Would you know an exclamation point if you saw one in a ring? Or what about a question mark? What about ellipses? You know what I mean, those little dots. What about those? What if it's just a simple period? Could you identify those? And what do these things even mean in a pro wrestling context? Well, to start the conversation, we have to think of a string of wrestling moves or a spot as a phrase or sentence. And what comes at the end of a sentence? A punctuation mark. So, let's break that open a bit, shall we? I'm going to use an example that we've all seen in a wrestling ring before to help illustrate this point, okay? So we've got two wrestlers in the ring and they tie up in a collar and elbow. One grabs a side headlock, there's a push back to the ropes and a running spot begins. One wrestler drops down, the other crosses over, then they leapfrog, this wrestler goes underneath, and then on the way back, there is a hip toss. And one of the wrestlers is thrown down to the mat. That is a spot. For the purpose of this, that is a sentence. And now a punctuation must occur. Something has to come at the end of that sentence. And that is the pin attempt, the effort to win the match. And if we were going to put the most basic punctuation of all there, a period, well, your most standard issue cover might follow that hip toss. Something that we've seen thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times in wrestling matches across years. Just your most garden variety cover could end that sentence with a period. I'm going to take this opportunity to switch out my wrestling hat for my writing hat. If you were writing a novel and every sentence ended with a period, this repetition of sentence type would grow monotonous to the reader. And take it from a guy who knows, remember I wrote some books, it becomes monotonous to you as the writer as well. You would not just end every single thing with a period. You need greater variety if you want to keep the attention of the reader. And this translates directly into our analogy of punctuation in wrestling matches. If everything you do ends in a period, the most standard issue cover ever, that's going to grow monotonous. So you need some variety. And to that end, I want to give you at least 3 other alternatives that you can start to build in. A new way of thinking about something we often don't spend much time considering. We can readily understand what it is to put a period at the end of a wrestling sentence by a garden variety cover that occurs. But what would it mean if instead we wanted to spice things up with an exclamation point? Well, you might be able to readily imagine. Think of a pin in which a wrestler pounces on the other one, deeply hooks both legs. They drive with their feet to try and bring that weight up across the plane of their shoulder blades and hold them down. There's a lot of energy and intensity. It's emphatic. And even if it were to follow that same spot we used in the example that ended in the hip toss, we can make it feel different by choosing different punctuation at the end of the sentence. That same spot that once ended with a period is going to feel very different if it now comes with an exclamation point. Okay, so we can all understand what an exclamation point might look like compared to a period. But what if we wanted to shift gears and take a look at ellipses? How does that function in the grammar of professional wrestling? Well, the ellipses, right, those 3 dots you might see in the middle of a sentence sometimes, that means that there is a pause, that there's going to be a delay in the revelation of the next piece of information. Well, how do we create that feeling in wrestling? In my opinion, that is exactly what happens when both opponents are down on the mat, having taken some damage, and one crawls to the other, and there's that delay before the cover occurs. That delay, that mounting tension that occurs as one wrestler is attempting to get to the pin, creates the effect of ellipses. And that, at the end of a spot, feels very different than either the period or the exclamation point. Here's one other for you to consider. What about a question mark? What would that look like at the end of a wrestling sentence or spot? Well, can you picture this? Imagine that a small package, an inside cradle, is occurring. But as the 2 count is happening, the small package turns over in the favor of the other wrestler. In fact, maybe it even flip-flops back and forth a few times. Or consider any fish out of water spot where who has control over the spot is constantly changing. It's not clear to the audience who is in control at that moment. In my opinion, that is putting a question mark at the end of your wrestling sentence. And just considering the ones that we've already talked about, whether it's a period or an exclamation point or ellipses or a question mark, right there you've created tremendous variety, not by necessarily changing out what moves you are doing or the speed at which they are deployed, but how it ends, how we get to the punctuation mark that indicates to the audience this sentence, this spot, is over. All right, loyal members of the Till We Make It tribe, I need to put your brains on the case here. Many years ago, I heard very offhandedly a wrestler tell me that they thought another option is to put a comma at the end of a wrestling spot or sentence. And after they were gone, and I was thinking about it, I realized I don't know what that would be. I have no idea. But if you do, I want you to leave it for me down in the comments, please, because up until the moment I pressed record, and probably for way more time than I ever should have, I've actually given that a lot of consideration. I can't wrap my brain around it. What do you think that would look like, given what we just talked about with periods and ellipses and question marks? What would a comma be in the grammar of wrestling? I would love to know. I can't wait to read your ideas. If you want to dive even deeper into understanding these concepts of pro wrestling, the performative and the structural, let me give you my toolbox. Toolbox Building Better Pro Wrestling is both a print book and an audiobook. I read it to you myself, and it's an extension of the work I did in 7 Keys to Becoming a Better Performer. Links to these are down below in the descriptus.